Welcome back, everyone. I hope that folks who are online have had a chance to grab a coffee and a snack as we head into the middle of the afternoon. I'm very happy to introduce our fourth panel in today's conversation, which is on governing climate change. And would like to introduce our moderator, who has just done an excellent job of corralling. He asked if he could ring the bell, and I said yes. So welcome back, Robert Miller, who is the professor at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, where he is also the Willard H. Pedrick Distinguished Research Scholar. And the director of the Rosette LLP American Indian Economic Development Program. He is the Chief Justice for the Pascua Yaqui Tribe Court of Appeals and an appellate judge for other tribal courts. He graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School in 1991 and then clerked for Judge Diarmuid. I totally ruined Diarmuid, thank you. It's a long day. Scanlane of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in 1991-92. He is a member of the American Philosophical Society and was elected in 2014 and has written lots of really fantastic articles on Indian law issues and actually did a great program with us, was that 2 years ago now? On the McGirt versus Oklahoma decision. So if you haven't checked that one out, it's on our YouTube channel. It was really a fantastic conversation. He is also a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. And with that, I will turn it over to Bob, who will introduce our speakers and get us started for our fourth session. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. I enjoyed shaking the bell because I have such little authority that I was glad to have a little bit more authority. I'm delighted to be here. Thank everyone that invited me. I'm glad to be involved and to learn from this wide variety of papers and people from around the world. And we have more of that opportunity today. So I'm going to take up as little time as possible, quick introductions. Then I have a couple of devil's advocates questions at the end for all three of you maybe, and then that will get us off and running. I'm just going to go in the order that folks are listed in the program. We have a PhD student, Ian Seavey, is with us. He went through an arduous trip yesterday to get here because of, I guess, the hurricane's named after you, Ian. Very appropriate. He is a PhD candidate at Texas A&M University. And his research looks at U.S. colonial relationships with Puerto Rico and through disaster situations, disaster relief policies. His dissertation pretty much mirrors the title of his talk, Colonial Calamities, the Politics of U.S. Disaster Relief in Puerto Rico. And he tries to tell the story how evolving ideas about American disaster relief have fundamentally shaped the colonial relationships between the United States and Puerto Rico. If you know who our prior librarian was before Patrick, the next comment about you, I'm not going to read the whole bio here, but he enjoys playing guitar in heavy metal bands. And if you knew that our prior librarian still plays in, I don't know if heavy metal, but he plays guitar in bands. The next speaker will be attorney Kelsey Jost-Creegan. She's the supervising staff attorney and an associate research scholar and a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. And she works on the Human Rights Clinic and Human Rights Initiative. Her paper, I found stuff I didn't know anything about, very interesting. A look at how the extractive industry uses counter-insurgency methods to put down, even to assassinate, land defenders, water defenders, rights offenders. So I'm looking forward to what she has to say. She's been involved in litigation in this type of advocacy world, sued Chiquita Banana for using Colombia paramilitaries, and now I lost track. And a lawsuit against the International Finance Corporation for terrorizing land rights movements in Honduras. So this is real world activity and fighting back, I suppose, against climate change initiatives. She also was, I found this very interesting, again, because I used to be a practicing lawyer, I'm a law professor now. She was part of the litigation team that sued the former president of Bolivia and won a $10 million verdict for these same type of issues, counterinsurgency against land, water, air defenders. Last but not least is Professor Dr. Muhammad Mumtaz. He's an assistant professor, in the Department of Public Administration at Fatima, Jinnah, Women's University in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. And before that, he was an assistant professor at the University of Haripur. I didn't ask you, I hope I said that right. Also in Pakistan. He owns his PhD degree in public administration and government from Sao Paulo University in Brazil, and served as a visiting scholar in the University of Delaware here in the United States. And his research focuses on what he will be talking about today, climate change, adaptation, policies, and mitigation at the local level. So I'm delighted to welcome you all here. I suppose you're perfectly welcome to speak from there, or anyone can, I guess we've just been however people choose. Use the podium if you would like. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
All right, well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. Robert stole my punchline of Hurricane Ian, unfortunately. But I want to thank the American Philosophical Society for putting on this wonderful event and being able to present my research to you all. So like he said, my presentation and paper is entitled Commonwealth of Calamity, Hurricanes and U.S. Colonialism in Puerto Rico. Before I want to get going, I want to acknowledge, I would be a bad hurricane scholar if I didn't acknowledge the suffering and the victims of Hurricane Ian in Florida, and also Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico. I have some dear friends in both places that my heart goes out for, so I want to definitely make sure that their presence and their situation is known for sure. So if you don't really know about Puerto Rico and its political status, I'm going to give you a brief kind of overview of that. So Puerto Rico is considered a Commonwealth of the United States, and it gained Commonwealth status in 1952. And this basically means that Puerto Rico is able to elect its own governor. It's not a presidential appointee anymore. In addition to that, Puerto Ricans can elect a colonial insular legislature as well. And even though they are Puerto Ricans are United States citizens, they are not allowed to vote in any federal legislation, or they're not allowed to vote for president as well. This is kind of my way of saying, so for me, the way I'm looking at it, Commonwealth is equal to colonialism. It's colonialism by another word, by another name. And I want to have us think about that as we're going through this presentation. And something else that I really want to highlight is we've been talking a lot about disasters today. The word natural disaster has been used abundantly. I kind of want to break that down a little bit because what we have to realize, we have to understand, especially in the case with Puerto Rico, is that me and critical disaster studies scholars pose that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. So if we take a moment and think about that old adage, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound? The very similar thing to disaster. So let's say a hurricane hits a remote island that no one's living on. Is that a disaster? I would say no. The reason why there's no such thing as natural disasters, when we think of quote-unquote disasters, like we think of hurricanes, we think of earthquakes, we think of things like that. But where the rubber meets the road is really when that interacts human cultures, that interacts human communities. When these environmental hazards, as we call them, environmental hazards impact human communities, that's when a disaster happens. So that kind of underlies the structural conditions. So when a hurricane or an earthquake, is visited upon a community, the structural conditions are really laid bare. So you see immense, you see the poverty, you see the political instability, you see economic exploitation, you see all of those things. So when studying hurricanes, specifically in Puerto Rico, we get a real sense that there's a lot of these structural issues that have not been dealt with over periods of time. And specifically, the United States kind of colonial government, or as we like to call it, the federal government, over in 57 times since the United States has acquired Puerto Rico in the War of 1898, hurricanes have hit Puerto Rico, and that's 57 times for the United States to assert colonial dominance over Puerto Rico through disaster relief, and that's kind of what I look at specifically. Much like war, hurricanes in Puerto Rico cause immense upheaval, and the United States American colonial government, they just kind of view them as periodic disturbances and try to put out the fire as cheaply and as quickly as possible. But as I said earlier, what really happens during these hurricanes is we see the structural issues that are magnified by this, and these structural issues are not dealt with in terms of in terms of like sustainability. So we're talking about poverty, we're talking about disease, we're talking about infrastructural sustainability, things that are like really key for society to function. So that is why we say there is no such thing as a natural disaster. What hurricanes in Puerto Rico also do, in the United States has kind of asserted, is it's created these really key precedents, political, economic, and social precedents at the beginning of the 20th century. So in 1899, the first time the United States had to deal with a hurricane in Puerto Rico, as it just got Puerto Rico from the Spanish in the War of 1898. Key precedents were established. First, we see Puerto Rico's economy completely switching. The United States completely switches Puerto Rico's economy from being a massive coffee producer, one that was probably outside of Cuba in the Spanish Empire, was the most key coffee producer in the Spanish Empire. The hurricane in 1899 destroyed that, and there was going to be a 5-year rehabilitation. It would take 5 years. So the American civil government on the island and American policymakers are going to say, okay, hey, so coffee's out. Let's kind of grow sugar so that we can create our American sugar kingdom in the Caribbean and continue to exploit and grow the American empire. So that I view is directly tied to this hurricane. In addition, we have hallmarks of American disaster relief, is what I call hallmarks. So some of these hallmarks include creating conditions to receive aid. So imagine you're standing there in 2 feet of water, your house is destroyed, and the American military government says, hey, go and bury your dead friend, or else we're not going to give you food to get through the night. We're not going to give you medical supplies. So conditions are directly attached to the aid. And that's established in 1899, but it continues throughout the 20th century, even into the 21st century, where there's conditions attached to receive aid. In addition, aid is also always kind of administered in a top-down structure. So we have FEMA, the federal, a federal agency in charge of that. So it's a very top-down structure. It's not going to the people. It's establishing kind of aid depots, and that's how it gets disseminated. And then lastly, we have political precedents that, like the Foraker Act in 1900, that basically states that Puerto Ricans at that time were not citizens, and then all federal laws in the United States apply, and that Puerto Rico cannot trade with anyone else. So that establishes that dependency, and this is immediately after the hurricane and immediately after the switching of the Puerto Rican economy. In addition to that, key Puerto Rican voices. I know I'm not talking a lot about Puerto Rican voices. I discuss it more in my paper, but key Puerto Rican voices are continually steamrolled in these after disasters. They have, Puerto Ricans on the island have extremely great experience with this. It's part of culture. The American government doesn't realize that hurricanes are a significant part of cultural production in Puerto Rico, whether it be art, whether it be literature, poetry, things like that. And this is a huge deal, and these Puerto Rican voices are being steamrolled by the American federal government to prop up the colonial regime and prop up kind of America's empire, so to say. This is why these precedents are continued today in moving forward, even with kind of Hurricane Fiona, with the massive amounts of power outages that are still not that are still not being fixed. And guess who owns that power? A private American company that owns the rights to provide power to Puerto Rico. So these precedents are still being felt today, and this is why I fundamentally believe that hurricanes and the American colonial state in Puerto Rico are so symbiotic. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Hello. Thanks to everyone who's spoken today. I think my presentation has already been enriched by listening to all of these amazing presentations, and it's definitely left me thinking. So I'm going to be speaking about the use of counterinsurgency strategies against climate defenders. This comes from, interest in this paper came from the experience of working with climate defenders and experiencing or witnessing the violence that they're experiencing. And so I think, like Ian, wanting to be first very grateful for all that they have taught me, and also really root this in the fact that this is ongoing violence that people are experiencing every day. So just some definitions. Who are climate defenders? So the United Nations has a definition for environmental defenders, who are individuals and groups who, in their personal or professional capacity and in a peaceful manner, strive to protect and promote human rights relating to the environment, including air, land, flora, and fauna. So climate defenders are understood to be a subset of environmental defenders. I will say that part of this paper problematizes perhaps the concept of focusing on defenders because it's focusing on the individual as opposed to the movement. But I'm going to use the term because it is how a lot of this problem has been conceptualized, and it's also how a lot of the response has been conceptualized. I'm also going to use the term extractivism as a term to referring to the global economic system operating in the context in which climate defenders work. It's a term that's been developed by scholars in the Global South. It's linked to dependency theory, and it specifically discusses the extraction of natural resources in large volumes or with high intensity, where at least half of the resources are exported, and those resources are exported as commodities. So, climate defenders, their advocacy may be professional or it might be volunteer, and it often intersects with development projects. They're often calling for accountability and denouncing corruption. And as is the case with environmental defenders, there's a really strong intersection with land rights defenders. So many environmental and climate defenders are also land rights defenders in rural communities in particular. They use a whole range of strategies, some of which have been spoken about today, storytelling, for example, but also direct action, legal action, government advocacy, all different modes of advocacy. And why are they important? Climate defenders are, I think this has been discussed today. If we are understanding that local communities have solutions that we need to be looking to, then the first line of defense is protecting those local communities, because if they are annihilated, then we won't be able to learn from their experience, and it's also not climate justice. So they're already experimenting with imagined futures, and they are, I think we can conceive of them as protectors of what we've talked about today as localized epistemologies. Global Witness has been the main NGO that's documented violence against climate defenders. These are the most recent numbers released this week of the number of killings by country. Certain countries, Brazil, Colombia, Philippines, Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala, routinely show up as the most violent countries for climate and environmental defenders. And violence is much more than murder. Murder is what Global Witness tracks. But as John Knox, who's the former special rapporteur on human rights and the environment, flags, for every one defender that's killed, there's sometimes 20 to 100 more that are harassed, unlawfully arrested, and sued for defamation, among other types of intimidation. So violence takes the form of not only assassinations and extrajudicial killings, but also assault, torture, sexual violence, threats and stigmatization, displacement, surveillance, and infiltration. So the question that a lot of folks who work in this field are tackling or engaging with is, what are the root causes of this violence, and how do we protect climate defenders, both in terms of how do we protect them right now, and how do we address the root causes. So that's why I wanted to pull in the lens of counterinsurgency theory. Counterinsurgency theory is rooted in it was developed in the period of attempting to push back against anti-colonial movements. So it's rooted in asserting colonial power. And it also is very tied to spreading a particular model of international development, which I define as extractivism. It understands insurgency as the final intended outcome of a revolutionary campaign, which begins with nonviolent political and industrial demonstration and dispute. What's important about this is that counterinsurgency itself, as Schrader says, is a misnomer because there doesn't necessarily have to be an insurgency for counterinsurgency strategies to begin to be implied. Instead, the theory views nonviolent movement itself as the root of an insurgency and a potential threat. And then even once an insurgency is developed, it follows the logic that insurgency cannot sustain itself without the help of civilians. So this is the gorilla must move through the people as a fish swims in the sea. So you have to target unarmed actors in order to be able to put an end to an insurgency. So this creates what I call the figure of the troublemaker, as Bill McKibben describes here, which is defenders are at risk because they find themselves living on or near something that corporations are demanding. That demand, the demand for the highest possible profit, the quickest possible timeline, the cheapest possible operation, seems to translate eventually into understanding somewhere that a troublemaker must go. And so, as I mentioned, this incorporates then the logic of preemptive action. We have to act against a nonviolent movement before it potentially becomes a violent insurgency. These logics, there's more about this in the paper, much more has been studied by other scholars. The United States has been a key player in diffusing them to law enforcement around the world through the use of military assistance, political assistance, and anti-narcotics assistance. I think what's particularly telling is that the terms that we see climate defenders being stigmatized as are communists, drug traffickers, criminals, and terrorists, which align pretty much directly with the Cold War, the war on drugs, and the war on terror. In practice, what does this look like? Defenders are seen as a threat because they pose a challenge to the extractivist development model. They call for policies that, if implemented, may actually pose an existential threat to some industries. And they often name and shame specific corporate and government actors. And so the typologies of violence that are used against them include not only targeted assassination, but criminalization, stigmatization, surveillance, and infiltration, which are strategies that were formed within the counterinsurgency logic of attempting to break the movement itself. What's important about that is that it's while we are looking at individualized violence, in fact, it's a strategy against the movement as a collective. And so in terms of implications for designing protection strategies, one thing that this highlights is that protection needs to be thought about as a collective protection strategy, not in terms of the individual, because the strategy is designed to get at the movement as a whole. It also highlights the importance of studying not only lethal violence, which has been perhaps the most focused on, but also non-lethal violence. Problematizes the role of security forces because often it is explained that security forces are involved because of corruption. While corruption is a huge problem, if the security force itself sees the movement as a threat, it's not necessarily corruption that's leading them to act. It's a part of the actual culture of the organization. And finally, addressing extractivism itself as a root cause. Questioning whether extractivism can exist without violence. It is a strategy that's rooted, an economic model itself is rooted in violence, both against the earth and against the communities that live alongside extractive projects. And so I think while a lot of strategies have suggested, sort of a Band-Aid approach, that seems to imply that we can resolve this violence, get rid of the bad apples, and it will all be okay. I think looking at these logics and their roots in anti-colonial violence suggests that really the model itself is a part of the problem and that perhaps it cannot be executed without these forms of violence against communities.
Thank you very much for American Philosophical Society for inviting me for this important talk. Since yesterday we are discussing about the climate change, etc., there are a lot of things that has been taken place. We have a science and historical perspective. Now the question is that now it is an established fact that we do have a climate change, but the question is how we have to respond to that climate change. So it's being responded at every level around the world. It depends upon the situation. There was basically two kind of strategies has been adopted. The first one is a mitigation strategy that has been taken place since we can say it the Rio Protocol 19 Rio Declaration, rather I may say 1992, and then onward we have a lot of agreement, a lot of framework established to face the climate change. Primarily, it was attempted to address the challenge of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emission, and the focus was remained on mitigation measure that we have to minimize the greenhouse gas emission. Now, but the problem is that a lot of countries around the world, they don't have a lot of contribution toward greenhouse gas emission, but how they have to manage the impact of climate change. For instance, I'm talking about the Pakistan. Pakistan is contributing less than 1% to the greenhouse gas emission. It's 0.9%. But when it comes on the impacts of climate change, so we are the fifth most vulnerable country around the world. So in that case, do we need to have a mitigation strategy? Of course, they are important, but at the same time, we have to adjust, we have to make the arrangements, we have to make the adjustment with the potential impacts of climate change. For that, it is called as adaptation. We have to adapt with the impacts of climate change. So those countries who are most vulnerable to the climate change, they do not have a lot of contribution toward the greenhouse gas emission. For them is adaptation strategy. If we see the Paris Agreement 2015, so it has recognized that adaptation is equally important to the mitigation. If we see the Kyoto Protocol, I would not say it was a kind of unsuccessful experience. It was, up to some extent, it was successful, but it was a partially successful. We did not get that much intended result still because even yesterday we were saying the temperature is even rising up. So in that scenario, in the Paris Agreement, it was decided there are basically the two kind of the main landmark, I may say. The first one is to focus on adaptation measure, and the second one is you have to get the bottom-up approach. If we see previously in case of mitigation, it was top-down approach. The federal government and the national governments, they were making the kind of policies and frameworks, but in case of adaptation, so we have to come up with the bottom-up approach, that is the local governance, because when we are saying the adaptation, it varies from society to society, it varies from one place to another place. So I will show you an example that how it has impacted Pakistan. So this is just a scheme of my presentation. So this is the Pakistan. Maybe you might not be, some of you are not familiar with the Pakistan. If we see at the east, we have India bordering with India. On the western side, it's Afghanistan. On our northern side, it's China. So Pakistan is embroiled, you can say, it two biggest economy, that is China and India. At the same time, we can say they are also one of the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emission. And we do have bordering with Iran. So I'm focusing on this area, that is the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is basically bordering with Afghanistan. Why we are choosing, I choose this area for my study. It's basically one of the regions that is highly impacted due to climate change. If we see the previous, the floods or the other impacts on the climate, so this is the kind of more vulnerable area in the country. So this is why I choose for this specific study. So I already mentioned that Pakistan is the fifth most vulnerable country due to climate change, and recently it has estimated more than 20 billion losses has occurred due to the events that are directly linked with climate change. So in order to face all the scenario, the government has taken multiple steps to encounter the challenge of climate change. It has been taking place, the action at the national level as well as at the subnational. So this is just the flooding that we have just recently, the past month. So almost 1/3 of the country is underwater. More than $20 billion losses has occurred due to these flooding. So everything is almost swept. So in that situation, we have to see how we can address this challenge. So if we see at the national level or the overall context, so what the Pakistan has done so far, the first thing is they do have their separate Ministry of Climate Change. Under the portfolio of ministry, they have established the National Climate Change Policy back in 2012. So this is a very comprehensive document that it provides us that how you have to fix the issue of climate change. And not only they have established the policy, but at the same time, they have also created the framework for the implementation of this policy. And then we do have established the Climate Change Council. This is a kind of authority at the apex level that the Prime Minister will headed it, and all the Chief Minister from the provinces. And on the heels of 18 constitutional amendments, so we have realized that at the national level, it's not appropriate or it's not possible to address this challenge that we are facing, because at the community level, it's across the country, we have a different kind of challenge. For instance, if on the one side of Pakistan, we have Himalayas, there are different kind of challenges. If we see the other province that is in the Karachi, we have the hottest season over there. So we must have to delegate the authorities, or you can say the responses we have must be at the different scale. On that 18 constitutional amendment, the subnational government, or you can say the provinces, are responsible for implementation of the policy, not only for implementation, rather now they are also framing their own policies. And then at the provincial level, they have also established the provincial climate change action plan and policy as well. So I will skip this slide. This is about the adaptation, why adaptation is important and how the world is focusing on adaptation, particularly those countries who are most vulnerable due to climate change. For them is adaptation. If we see all the documentation that we have, the public document created by Ministry of Climate Change and the government of Pakistan, either it's at the federal level or the provincial level, mainly they are focusing on adaptation. As I mentioned, we are not creating a lot of greenhouse gas emission, but we are the victim of climate change, so we have to manage it. There is no way to escape. So this study is basically is conducted to understand the responses of subnational government to climate change adaptation policy, to identify the effective measures that are being taken place for climate change to counter it at subnational level, and thirdly, it will give us some kind of challenges that the Pakistan is facing. Maybe it can be a case study, or it can be equally applicable for the other countries as well. Not totally applicable, but this kind of give us some kind of lessons that the other country may face the same thing. So the case study method was we applied for 6 months. I have been engaged with the relevant ministries and the stakeholder policymakers, including the other staff, those people who are working with the climate change. They are even the think tanks or the academia as well. So what the KP government has done, that I showed you in the slide, the part that I have done. Firstly, to face the challenge, they have established provincial climate change policy. Now, it's a subnational subject, so they are creating the policies as well as the implementation framework at the subnational level. Secondly, what we got the awareness campaign of climate change. So Pakistan is a kind of diverse country. We have a multi-language, maybe more than 30 languages are being spoken in Pakistan. So how it's difficult just to publish a document just in one language. Either our national language is Urdu, or you can say the English. So this is not possible. So what the government is doing, even at that provinces, they are publishing the thing related to climate change in different local languages. So I believe this is something very important. So why I say even on the next, I would have to say that, but previously during my PhD study, I have realized that I have witnessed, I visited the farmers. So when I was asking them that how your farms or the crops are being impacted due to climate change, so they were not a kind of accepting the thing that the climate change is something. So the behavior of the population is over there. They were saying this is a kind of natural phenomena. Even can you believe that on this, the flooding situation, some people are still saying that this is a kind of punishment or something like that. So for that context, it is highly important to educate the public. If your public is not ready, if you have, I would say, being a policy analyst, if you have established thousands of policy, it will never work until and unless your public is ready. So even yesterday, the talk we have, the community level, it was basically the same thing, that we must have to ready to the community. They have to act, they have to adopt, everybody have to adopt. For that, we must have to educate them, we must make them aware that what is climate change, and we must have to realize them. So this is not a natural phenomena, rather it's human induced, and we can face it whether it's natural or anything else. The third thing that is important I have seen is the government has established a kind of linkages with the universities and devising curriculum. At the university level, even now, the government is even planning at the schooling, at the primary school level, that the education of climate change, so especially the target is the young population, so they can become aware that what is the phenomena of climate change and how we have to face it. Of course, encouragement of research, although there is not that much level at extensive level research, but still the government is trying to encourage, and they are giving some sort of funding at the universities or the other agencies. They are sponsoring the project that are related to climate change. Another thing that is we found during our study is training to the farmer and the local community. As I mentioned previously, that the local community, they are not realizing that much how the climate change is impacting them. They know that the temperature is rising and our crops are being destroyed. They know that the floods are there, but they don't know why it is being happen. So this is the responsibility of the government and the academia as well. And another very important thing is, for all these activities, we need finances. So the KP government, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government, has allocated some kind of budget, about 2 billion Pakistani rupees. It's almost 9 million rupees. It's not that $9 million. It's not that much, but still under the head of climate change. So this is a kind of a positive thing that we can say it. Even at the global level, some countries, they are even dedicating the specific budget toward a climate change. Okay. So these are some other things that they are even collecting data at the local level. So data is significantly important. It tells us that how the things are being happening. So they are collecting data at the grassroots level. So the thing is that I have been involved with the provincial climate change policy in the we have consultation workshop, etc. And now the government is planning that instead of even the subnational level or the provincial level, we should have to make the policies at the grassroots level, maybe at the district level. Likewise, engaging the NGOs, the non-governmental organization, and the other international organization, they are providing a kind of advocacy or helping to the government as well as at the local community as well. A formal contribution to the public perception about climate. So this is very important, because what the government is doing, they are looking for what the farmers, they are doing, how they are adapting to the situation, and then they are trying to bring those things in the policies. So this is the target is to bring the kind of hidden adaptation so that what the farmers are doing, it should be the part of policy, how the knowledge is being transformed within the community, and how the things are being done at one place of the farmer, maybe that can be replicated at another place, and the government is also trying to do, and as well as the community as well. So the final analysis that I found it, the good thing is, the first one is they have established the policy, the public awareness is over there, involvement of the relevant stakeholder, that the farmer community or the other local actor, non-governmental organization at the local level, at the international organization, they has been involved. So they are trying to create a policy science linkage. So it's a kind of very complex thing. This is not even at the developing world. We have done so far the science policy interface, but we are trying to get the data at the grassroots level, at the district level, so as to make the policies that are based on the scientific evidence. And of course, the capacity building, they are trying to train the people, as well as making some kind of arrangement, like they have established the Climate Change Council, and some at the local level, they are trying to establish some kind of institution as well. And autonomous adaptation is the one that the farmers, they are doing by themselves without any interference by the government. And this is also the autonomous adaptation is also encouraged, and they are considering that the farmer, whatever they are doing, they are trying to document it, and then at the later stage, it will be being placed at the policy as well. So what are the drivers behind those things? The one was is a kind of, we have seen the coordination is the engagement of academia, institutional capacity, and research activities. So these are the things that are the drivers toward the government action, because the government realized that based on some scientific thing, although it's not too much, but whatever we have in the hand, based on that, they are trying to establish the policy. And autonomous adaptation, that how the farmers are adapting themselves. So it's basically the previous experience of the farmers. So I don't think so I have a lot of time to give the examples, but maybe later I can tell you if somebody is interested to know that how actually the farmers are adapting themselves. And sustainability in the agriculture production, because agriculture is the main sector that is being disturbed. And then the third one is the driver is the knowledge sharing. The farmer, from one farmer, if he or she is doing some kind of positive adaptation, then it share the same practice with another farmer, and then they are trying to replicate the same thing. So the challenge that we have found, because there are climate change is linked with many things. This is not just only one thing. Your energy is there, water sector is there, agriculture is there, forestry is there, and industry is there. So all these things are there. Unfortunately, what we are lacking, so many things are replicated in different policies. They are not taken place. They should have to bring those all the actors at the same level. So this is the problem that we found during the study. Secondly, it's a confusion kind of at the vertical level. Still, I mentioned you that after the 18th constitutional amendment, the subject has been devolved to the province, but still there is confusion. Who is the responsibility? What kind of responsibility is still with the federal? Who will deal with the at the international level kind of protocols, at the mechanism, at the same time, the finances problem as well. Financial constants are there, of course, lack of systematic monitoring system. Although we have some kind of partially, they have established the different committees, etc., but they are not as such functional. And lastly, scarcity of empirical research and lack of substantial adaptive capacity. Still, we need to have a lot of research that how the policies are being implemented and what kind of challenges they are there. And what sort of lesson we have learned from this study or through this province. The first thing is exploration of hidden adaptation. This is just last me 1 minute. Adaptation that the farmer, whatever they are doing, so the government is trying to identify those things. So I personally believe what the farmers are doing, what the local community is doing, that should be the policy measures. So the government is trying to bring those things in the policy documents. So this is one thing. The secondly one is the sharing transfer of adaptation strategies among the farmer community. So one part of the province, if some farmers are doing some successful experience, it is being shared with the other community as well. The third one is they have introduced massive level awareness campaign through using the mass media. They are even using the radios, televisions, and even the local newspaper, etc. So it's creating a kind of competition among the subnational government level as well. So what we have found, so special kind of funding from the federal government is also being provided to those subnational governments that they are performing well. Activism of political leadership. If you see the leadership that we have, the political party that is leading at the KP, that is Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, for last 8 years they are quite active. Previously, we do have ex-Prime Minister Imran Khan. In his every second speech, he talked about the climate change and how we have to deal with it. So this is the conclusion. So question, and thank you very much.
Thank you all. If there are questions, I would rather hear your questions than mine, so if you're ready already, or I can ask a couple. Are there questions? I'll ask one while you're grabbing the microphones. Okay, well, I will go in the same order again. And as a law professor, we're used to asking tough questions, and so maybe I will be a devil's advocate here. Ian, these are federal disaster dollars. Who should decide how they're spent, or who should decide, I guess? The United States, or, I read your article, obviously, very closely. So how would you think these dollars should be applied to disaster situations?
That's a really good question. I think at this point, I think it really comes down to the status, Puerto Rico's political status. I think that how the insular government or the colonial government, that they should be the ones that should decide. It's their own land. It's their policy that's happening, that they should be the ones to decide, not necessarily the federal government. Even though it's federal government dollars, that's where there's a disconnect. And you'll see there's a lot of advocates on the island that will kind of espouse, Puerto Rico can do it themselves. Puerto Rico can do it themselves, disaster relief-wise, agriculture-wise, things like that. Don't need the U.S. help. But there's the opposite side of that, where there's also a faction of Puerto Ricans on the island that are very indebted to the United States, and like that there's that kind of federal kind of power in the background to help. So, but personally, I do believe, based upon kind of anti-colonial narratives and kind of what I've seen in talking with people in Puerto Rico, they believe they should have the decision on where the FEMA dollars go.
Well, I have a follow-up due to what you just said. How are FEMA dollars spent? I don't know. Does the federal government, now what's going to happen in Florida or what happened in New Orleans, does the feds just go in and make their own decisions, or do state governments have a lot of input in how FEMA dollars and aid is spent?
So that actually comes down to disaster declarations. So the federal government will declare a state of disaster, and that means that FEMA is going to go and basically gives FEMA kind of a carte blanche to go and organize and basically do disaster relief. And that's a government agency kind of having their own way with it. And obviously there's a lot of state cooperation when you go into a state, and there's cooperation in Puerto Rico as well. But if you compare what's going on in the states to what's going on in, let's say, Puerto Rico, a colony territory, as I was talking about in my paper, the Puerto Rican voices get steamrolled, whereas someone like, Governor DeSantis of Florida, they're going to listen to him more than they'll listen to the governor of Puerto Rico. So there is levels of that. But so to answer your question, FEMA kind of goes in, and after there's a disaster declaration, they are the ones that kind of have oversight.
Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose also with Puerto Rico, like how do, I guess compared to the other islands in the Caribbean, I guess how does their disaster response compared to them, and do those countries, since they are independent, like Cuba or Dominican Republic, or do they have better disaster response, or I guess how would you say it's different, and would Puerto Rico benefit from being independent? Or?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's kind of like an unspoken. The question.
Okay. Since there are several other countries in the area that are independent, do they benefit from that independence, and I guess in disaster relief? And would Puerto Rico be better off if it were independent, or does it still have enough benefits from being part of the U.S. that maybe something else would be preferable?
That's the age-old question. Should Puerto Rico be independent? But to go back to your original, or to the first part of your question about Caribbean solidarity, so to speak. There is kind of like a kind of unwritten, strange rule, even though Cuba is still a communist country to this day. There is like an unwritten kind of solidarity between between Caribbean communities when a hurricane hits. So like you will see. I think it was during Hurricane Maria. The Castro government in Cuba offered they offered to give aid to Puerto Rico. United States didn't take it, but it was a like a ceremonial kind of gesture. But to go to your specific point about do the other countries are they doing it better? That's a really good question. And I think if we look at Cuba specifically, Cuba's infrastructure, and especially when Castro took over, like early Cold War, he would, there was multiple hurricanes during like the 60s and 70s, and there was lots of press and lots of, there was they made a documentary about all of the disaster relief efforts in Cuba. It's a silent film. You can watch it on YouTube. It's called El Ciclón. Which is really interesting. And that is, so I don't know, I think Cuba definitely has kind of it under control. They have a good structure to the way they do it. But in terms of, would Puerto Rico be better off independently doing disaster relief? I think for disaster relief, yes. As far as Puerto Rico, whether it be a state or whether it be independent, that would be a more difficult discussion. And I mean, I'm willing to have that discussion. But yeah, I wanted to keep it towards like climate change and stuff like that and hurricanes. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Kelsey, is this a question to Ian or I want to include our other speakers? Okay, Kelsey, after reading your paper and of course being an American law professor, I'm interested in your discussion, brief mention about the Rico statutes and how they're used, you said, in the United States and abroad against environment defenders. For the audience, I barely know what Rico stands for, racketeers and corrupt influenced organizations, right? So what did you mean by that? How are U.S. corporations using Rico statutes here and especially abroad? The American law applies abroad?
Yeah, so there have been some attempts by corporations in the U.S., for example, around some of the pipeline construction, to use the RICO statute as a means of criminalizing defenders. I think that part of that comes from the fact that once you're in the conspiracy landscape of law, it is easier to pull others in and attribute higher levels of crime. So you get sort of a concept of like collective responsibility within the conspiracy, where everyone who has chosen to enter into the conspiracy is responsible for the crimes that are committed by that conspiracy. And so it sort of allows for a broader reach of criminalization under the RICO statute. How it's being used, I think within the United States, it's been used against defenders, particularly, like I said, around pipeline construction. In terms of its use abroad, there have been some cases where communities abroad will bring claims against companies or entities in the United States. And as a response to that, there's been the use of the civil RICO statute to sue as opposed to the criminal side. So to sue for damages in relation to constructing the use of using a lawsuit or bringing lawsuit as a conspiracy, part of a conspiracy against the company or attempt at defamation. So I think maybe that distinction is important between the criminal and the use of the criminal statute and the use of the civil statute.
Okay, and I'd also like to follow up that I teach Indian law, and you write a little bit about the Dakota Access Pipeline and what happened in the United States. So would you like to explain how the defenders of maybe I shouldn't use that word because that's your word, the advocates of the Dakota Pipeline, how did they use your strategies, what you write about, the counter-insurgency against the defenders there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly been one of the sites where this has proliferated in the United States, and I think you've seen use of a number of the different strategies I list in the paper. So certainly stigmatization of the defenders as being, anti-development, trying to block a pipeline that's necessary for energy for the country, and so, sort of otherizing the defenders. Certainly also that typically relies on sort of anti-Indigenous and racist assumptions. I think whenever stigmatization is used against Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, that's a component of what is happening. And then also the use of criminalization, so charges, false or unfounded charges against individuals that were involved, and then certainly significant amount of violence against individuals that were involved in the movement in terms of repression of protesters when a protest event is happening, and the tactics that are used, from use of tear gas to more physical confrontation with protesters. And then I think some of the surveillance is also really relevant to use in the United States of tactics to surveil advocates that are involved in movements like the Dakota Access Pipeline, to monitor their activities, and also attempts to infiltrate to collect information about what's going on.
Am I correct that most of the criminal charges brought against those Dakota Access protesters have now been dismissed years later?
I think that is the case, although I don't know. Yeah, I think that is correct.
Think
But that's often something that might happen with criminalization. The problem is the years in the middle.
Right.
And as well as the, criminalization and stigmatization are really intimately linked in that once you've been charged or accused of a crime, the stigmatization effect has often taken hold, even if eventually, years later when it's outside of the news, they're dropped and people don't necessarily hear about that part. They hear that you were charged and they have the association with your being violent. So I think, for example, in Honduras also, I work closely with communities that were, the Guapi Knoll mine, and a number of defenders were charged and criminalized and held for more than 2 years, arbitrarily detained. And then the charges were dropped as unfounded. But in the meantime, they've been detained during COVID, stigmatized, criminalized, and separated from their family and also separated from the movement, which breaks down the movement's own ability to organize in the time that their leaders are criminalized and physically removed from the space.
Bob Hauser, American Philosophical Society. My question is for Dr. Mumtaz. And that is, I don't know whether there are similar efforts to organize, to adapt in other provinces of Pakistan, and perhaps this is a question for the future rather than the present. But my question is, do you have any insight, given the current flood conditions throughout Pakistan, including the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, about the effectiveness of those preparatory actions in the present situation?
Thank you very much. In KPK, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the flood was also impacted. But if you see as I was sharing the example, there is one of the city in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, rather in the Peshawar Valley, in Peshawar, it's called Nowshera. So we have it's a kind of steep, and then we have a flooding over there. Last time, if you see the example of 2018 flooding, so the whole city was underwater. But this time it was safe because the government has constructed its almost 14 feet high wall on that area. And for this time, it was a kind of, we do not have that much disaster, or the water does not come in that specific city. As far as you said, the other provinces, in most of the cases, rather overall, the Pakistan is following the strategy of adaptation. During the presentation, I mentioned our problem is we have to make the adjustment with the changing impacts. Despite we have limited greenhouse gas emission, but the effects are there. We have to manage that effect. So across the country, the focus of all the provinces, even at the community level, it's on adaptation. The other provinces also follow the same process. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such interesting papers and comments. I just wanted to ask very quickly about, so Ian Hilder-Jordaens has a recent sort of classification of this shift that happens after Maria from the kind of relationship to Puerto Rico being one of using disasters to extract people for migration, and then after Maria being like, well, just let them die. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. And very quickly, Kelsey, I was just wondering about some of the other softer sides of power. I'm thinking really with a recent book by Erica Edwards, The Other Side of Terror. She discusses, of course, kind of the direct repression of Black power and how that translates into the global war on terror. But she also points to the fact that, in that context, there's the rise of kind of Black hyper-visibility. So I was just wondering, is there a counterpoint there in counterinsurgencies abroad to place certain kinds of actors within that context as the new model or what should be? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. So to talk about the migration, yeah, I didn't get a chance to talk about it a lot here, but that is something that after World War II, just massive amounts of people have been coming into the mainland, and especially after Maria. And if we look at the statistics, we normally think of Puerto Ricans that are migrating to the mainland as going to New York, but there's been recent research by Patricia Silver, and she states that Central Florida is where most of the Puerto Rican migrants are going. And that's something that we haven't seen recently. It's more due to, I think, climate factors, and also due to the growing kind of infiltration of ideas and things like that coming into Florida. And it's more, it's still a global space, but climate-wise, it's a definitely a wider space for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I think this was mentioned in the paper, but I think there's a very intimately connected relationship here, because the era of the first wave of police assistance, global police assistance from the United States, the era of the first wave of police assistance from the United States is in the 60s and 70s, and Hoover and the FBI are deeply involved in that effort. And so there are strategies that were developed through COINTELPRO. I think COINTELPRO is the domestic application of these same counterinsurgency strategies against communities, especially often Black and also to some degree Indigenous communities in the United States. And then we see that being diffused through police assistance all around the world. And what's in a footnote here, because I haven't gotten the chance to develop it as much yet, is there is actually a correlation between the countries that have the highest number of killing and countries that receive that assistance and countries that have received highest rates of US police assistance and anti-narcotics assistance in the middle. If I'm understanding, I haven't read the book, so I want to make sure I understand the term, but Black hypervisibility as like an increased visibility in society in general as a result of that violence, both positive and negative, it sounds like, in terms of, okay. I think that goes a little bit to something that was said earlier today about sort of the risks and questions of fetishization of the local, which I think is a real question, because I think many of us, I think it's very important to raise up these examples of the local, but it's also important not to be romanticizing that situation, because I think a lot of the strategies that frontline communities are developing are really strategies of survival, because they're at the point of potential extermination. And so, I think it's very helpful to look at those strategies, but also to complicate the fact that those aren't necessarily, we don't want all of us to get there. And also, this has been a problem with the labeling of defenders as individuals in particular, because some defenders who have been highlighted, it can increase their risk. And so that's a part now, I think, a more conscious part of security assessment before there's activism around an individual defender is, do we think that this is going to be something that will help your security profile, or do we think it's going to be something that will increase risk? And I think making that calculus is really difficult, and I don't know that anyone has the answer yet, but I think it's a really important point, and I appreciate having the term to use for it now as well.
Thank you. I guess we have time for one more question. I have 10 more questions for each of them. What are we going to do? A coffee. Okay, please.
Such a great panel, so many questions. This one is for Kelsey in particular. I really appreciated your discussion of Rico statutes. And I wondered if you might also talk a little bit about anti-SLAPP legislation. My understanding is purely from a layperson's perspective, but when Representative Raskin introduced this federal anti-SLAPP legislation, the SLAPP Protection Act 2 weeks ago, I got really excited, and I wonder if you might just flesh out what that is and whether you have hopes that that legislation, A, will pass, and B, what protections it might afford defenders and their allies.
Boy, I really wish that some of my colleagues were here who work a little bit more on criminalization defense in the US. So I will caveat that most of my work has been with communities in Latin America. But SLAPPs, I mean, it's a term that applies both contexts. It's strategic lawsuits against public participation. And so I think just as a flag, one of the important things about criminalization, we use the term criminal, but it takes a number of forms. So it may be a criminal charge, but it can also be a civil suit, often taking the form of like a defamation suit. And it can also, and you know, the use of the civil RICO statute and other forms of judicial harassment, which can include things like freezing people's assets. And so, you know, the SLAPP suit has been something that has appeared in a number of contexts. I think in the US is where this term SLAPP arose, and it's been an increasing topic of concern among a lot of communities, a lot of activists that work with environmental communities, although that's not the only space in which this arises. So it arises in a number of different movement spaces. I mean, I certainly have hope with the statute. I think that it will increase, you know, the cost of engagement in those sorts of activities, because I think corporate actors often feel that they don't, there's no real risk to them to engaging in a SLAPP suit because, you know, they have the money to spend on it. And it's going to hold up the movement. It's going to take up movement time. It takes up the time of the lawyers. You know, if I'm defending someone from a SLAPP suit, that means I'm not taking a proactive strategy to seek accountability. And so it has like a lot of echoes beyond that individual. But so certainly hopeful about the, you know, the statute. Whether or not it will pass is a really important question. But I think at least it's a good organizing tool. I think whenever we do legislative advocacy, we're always hoping that it will pass, but obviously that depends on political whims. So both legislative advocacy and lawsuits, I think both of them are also organizing strategies and a way to center ourselves and educate the public and organize. So I think regardless of whether or not it passes, it's a really important step in that direction, but obviously hopeful that it would.
You want to, just very, very quick.
Yeah, I just would like to make one point. That is, in KPK, back in 2014, the government has introduced a billion tree tsunami project. That is, they actually planted 1 billion tree in the whole provinces. So during this flooding, it has seen that although those trees are not mature trees so far, but the initial report shows that the impact of or the frequency of the flood in those areas where they have planted that billion tree, it was a kind of minimum as compared to those areas where there was no plantation. So it was a kind of successful experience as well. The forestation in the area of KPK, this project was highly appreciated by World Economic Forum, World Bank, and some other international agencies as well. Thank you.
Great. So I'm sorry that we're out of time. There's so many more questions, but let's take about 10 minutes and just grab a quick cup of coffee and come back here at
Please join me in
3:23
thanking our
and thank
panel.
them. Thank you.